Hey everybody, my name is Tristan Tibby. I'm a psychology PhD student at UCLA, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about open science practices, or OSPs as they're commonly known as. And first and foremost, let's start with the definition of open science practices. And these practices are any practices that a researcher engages in to increase the transparency and/or reproducibility of their research. So these practices help make what the researcher did more clear to their audience, and it can also help with actually reproducing the results that came from that research. With this definition in mind, let's move into talking about some specific examples of open science practices. One such practice is registration. And registration is a time-stamped document that contains information about a study. This can include hypotheses, the study design, and the analysis plan. And with a registration published online, it can make it easier for others to seek out research studies that were conducted on a particular topic. And there's a particular type of registration that is specifically conducted before the completion of a study that's known as pre-registration. And in a pre-registration, this time-stamped document that has hypotheses, study design, analysis plan is actually compiled and posted prior to the completion of the study. So prior to data collection, or if it's secondary data that's being analyzed, prior to data analysis. And so all this information about the study is recorded before the results are known. Now, another open science practice is open data, code, and materials. And open data, code, and materials is exactly what it sounds like. It's the data that was analyzed in a study, or the code that was used to analyze it, or any other materials involved in conducting a study being made available to the public so that anyone can go and look at these resources that were used to analyze data and find results from a study. I want to caveat here that posting open data doesn't necessarily mean taking all the data that someone's gathered and just throwing it all out there online. A lot of times it involves de-identifying the data first, or even only including the variables that were used in a specific analysis. Another open science practice is replications. And replications are studies that follow the design of previous study in order to see if the same conclusions can be reached. So in a replication, a researcher is looking at a previous study that has been conducted and trying to follow as closely as possible what they did in order to see whether they find the same results, they reach the same conclusions as that previous study. Now there's a couple of different versions of replications to highlight here. One is the idea of an independent replication versus an internal replication. In an independent replication, the research team conducting the replication is completely separate from the research team that did the original study. Whereas an internal replication is that original research team that conducted the original study actually doing their own replication of their work. There's also a distinction between a direct replication and a conceptual replication. In a direct replication, it's actually looking very specifically at how the sample was gathered, how the participants were run through a particular protocol, how the data was analyzed, and using those steps and following them as closely as possible in order to see what the result is. Whereas a conceptual replication is a bit more loosey-goosey, and it's trying to achieve the same result maybe as the original study, but maybe isn't following to the letter the protocol and data analysis steps of the original study. Now that we've talked about a few of these different open science practices, it's worthwhile to touch base on why are these helpful in the first place? Why are they good for research? And there's a couple of different ways we can talk about this. Firstly, open science practices can help increase research transparency. And if we focus in on the examples of pre-registration and open data, we can help illustrate why this is the case. So with pre-registration, all of the steps that a researcher is going to engage in, what hypotheses they're going to lay out, how they're going to analyze their data, all of that is made publicly available and is recorded prior to the data being analyzed. And so in that way, researchers who are looking back on prior studies can see and ensure that what a researcher actually ended up doing is what they said they would do before the results were examined and seen. And so this makes it very transparent what the original plan was and what ended up happening. And with open data and code as well, This is making very clear what data was analyzed, and specifically sometimes the scripts that were actually used to analyze that data. So researchers who are trying to figure out what was done in a previous study aren't dependent on simply reading a journal article that may have limitations on word count and such, but they can actually go back to the source and look at how the data was analyzed and how the conclusions were reached. Furthermore, open science practices can increase our confidence in the conclusions from studies. And this becomes clearer if we think about the idea of replications. If we consider one study done in isolation that reached a particular conclusion, maybe we can't be too sure about that conclusion. But if that study has then been replicated multiple times, and each of those replications found the exact same result as that particular study, we can put a lot more trust, a lot more faith in that conclusion. And it builds a sounder body of research that future studies can be built on. Now, open science practices can also be beneficial to individual scientists or researchers as well. There's a couple different reasons that we can touch on. For one thing, open science practices are increasingly being considered beneficial in the realm of hiring and promotion, where seeing that studies that were published with these open science practices included, such as a study that included open data or open code, these are considered positives on a CV when considering whether someone will be hired, and also considered when looking at promotion and tenure. They also can be considered in whether a researcher receives grant funding as well. And also, just generally, there's this increased perception of rigor about a study that engages in these open science practices, which is good. And obviously, the caveat is that not always is having these hypotheses and stuff like that necessary to a study. There are particular realms and particular studies where the research might be exploratory. And so in that case, it's not a negative to not have hypotheses. So it is contextual. Now that we've talked about how open science practices are helpful, let's move on to the adoption of open science practices across researchers and across different academic fields. And one way to gauge this is to talk about these things called article badges. And article badges were introduced by a nonprofit organization known as the Center for Open Science. And it's ways to recognize that an article engages in these OSPs. There are such article badges as pre-registration, recognizing open data and open materials. And there's actually a journal that in 2018 introduced a badge specifically for replications as well. And looking at the Center for Open Science website, you can see that the journals that have begun implementing these badges span a lot of different disciplines. There's some in audiology, biostatistics, finance, microbiology, political science, psychology, toxicology. And in total, over 160 journals have begun implementing these badges. And there are some journals that don't implement these badges specifically, but have actually moved on to requiring these open science practices for any article that wants to be published there as well. Now, beyond looking at the very general journals in different fields, we can also look at evidence of increased adoption at the researcher level as well. A study that was conducted in 2023 found that among social scientists, the usage of these open science practices had increased from 49% in 2010 to 87% 10 years later, which is quite a drastic increase. Now, to summarize what we talked about in the video today, we first gave a definition of open science practices and talked about how they can enhance research transparency and reproducibility. We then moved on to talk about how these open science practices can also increase the confidence that we have in the conclusions that researcher studies find. And finally, we also talked about how the adoption of open science practices is continuing and it's growing across many academic disciplines and across researchers themselves. Thank you for watching.